Before we start today, I want to hold space for a moment. This month on Damn Parenting, I'm starting a series of conversations about parts of postpartum and motherhood that are, well, genuinely hard to talk about. And it's not because they're shameful, but it's because they've been made to feel that way. Not everyone experiences birth, postpartum, or motherhood the same way. Some of you are in the thick of it right now. Some of you might be looking back. Some of you may be pregnant and trying to understand what might be coming. Wherever you are, you belong in these conversations. These episodes may bring things up, and if they do, that's not a sign that something is wrong with you, but it is a sign that these conversations are reaching the right person. Today, we are talking about postpartum rage. We're going to say that word, and we're going to stay with it. And we're going to come out the other side with more understanding than we arrived with. You did not fail. You were not warned, and you are not alone. Welcome back to Damn Parenting. I'm your host, Eva. In the first year after my baby arrived, I found myself going from 0 to 100 basically in seconds. And I wasn't at a stranger. And I wasn't at the building renovation chaos that was genuinely destroying our daily life. And I wasn't at those family comments that sometimes, well, they landed like grenades. And I wasn't at that damn pump machine I was attached to, sometimes up to 8 times a day, just to keep my supply going. It was all at my husband, the easiest person to aim it all at. The person who was always exhausted, who was also figuring it all out, and who was doing his best. And, well, who happened to be the closest when everything finally became too much. I was touched out, I was mentally burnt out, I was sleeping in fragments, and, well, I was holding myself together in a version that kind of just looked functional, I guess, from the outside, but it felt like it was all dissolving from the inside. And that rage, because, well, I guess that's the word for it, it wasn't a personality flaw. And it wasn't proof that I wasn't cut out for this motherhood. It was a nervous system that had basically pushed past its limits in a country I wasn't born in, without any family nearby, and in a body, well, it had just done something enormous, and then I'd been handed a baby and paperwork and sent home. We need to talk about this today, and properly. Just to give you a bit of a stats moment, marriage quality declines for approximately 2/3 of couples within the first 5 years of having a baby, and the highest risk window is in year 1. Sleep deprivation alone causes a 60% increase in emotional reactivity, and a majority of new parents report a lack of communication as a key stressor. And for at least a year, 80% of couples report a significant reduction in any intimacy. Up to 1 in 5 couples separate or divorce within that first year of a baby's life, and 12% of first-time parents separate before the child's second birthday. Women are 60% more likely to initiate divorce after having a baby, and it's not because we stopped loving our partners. It was because of the unequal weight of the mental load, the invisible labor, the physical recovery. It accumulates into something that, well, it gets called rage. But is it really? I needed more. I didn't know how to ask, and nobody told me that this was coming. This is what it really is. And yet postpartum rage is not even in that DSM-5. It has no official clinical diagnosis. Standard postpartum screening tools, they don't even offer questions about anger at all, which means thousands of women walk into appointments describing exactly this and are sent home without a name for what they're experiencing. So what is this episode? Well, we cannot fix postpartum rage today because postpartum rage, it's not one thing. It lives in the intersection of hormones and sleep, the patriarchy, communication, support systems, identity, and a body that's been through something so profound. And that cannot be solved in these 30 minutes. What this episode is for, though, is to listen to a conversation, to get a better understanding, to find out if you need help or to get it here in the Netherlands, and to feel, well, just a little bit less like you're the only one. So with me today is someone I'm genuinely glad to have back. It's Dr. Naomi Gibson, who joined us in season 1 as our resident couples therapist. She has seen inside more postpartum relationships than most people will in a lifetime. And she said yes to coming back to talk about something she thinks we have been avoiding for too long. So Dr. Naomi, welcome back to Damn Parenting.
Thank you so much for having me back.
It feels like old times.
I know, it's very comfy.
Well,
in the Damn Parenting room.
I guess we're going to have to start at the beginning because I think there's genuine confusion about what this postpartum rage really is. So can you actually tell us what is it? What does it feel like? And how is it different from just being tired and stressed and just having a bad day?
It's not so much different from being tired and stressed per se. So it's an expression of anger. It could be an outwards expression, so shouting, losing your temper, being short with somebody, throwing something, kind of what we might imagine of anger. Or it can sometimes be sort of internalized anger, being kind of very critical towards yourself, but normally some kind of trigger and then an explosion or an internal explosion of some kind. And whilst we see it a lot in the postpartum period, because there's so many different layers of pressure, you mentioned them yourself, thinking about hormones, bodies that have changed and been through so much, the lack of support or perhaps a different level of support than you might have anticipated. Yeah, the sounds, the sensory kind of overwhelm, the noise of a baby, crying babies, these sorts of things, they all kind of shake us up. And lots of women, it's extremely common to notice an increase in anger, in rage, something that feels kind of, oftentimes clients describe it to me as being like different from how they've ever experienced anger before. Maybe they didn't really have that many expressions of anger up until having a baby, and then it feels like it's something that kind of can overwhelm you. And it is, there's many reasons why it's probably not very spoken about, but women can experience intense shame afterwards as well, and guilt around, why did I do that? What kind of mother shouts at their baby or shouts at their toddler or, attacks their husband for something seemingly minor, these sorts of things. And then that shame always keeps us quiet, right? We don't want to share what we feel shameful about. So I think that's one of the main contributing factors of why it's not so spoken about.
Can I ask about the physicalities of it? Because the phrase blood is always boiling, it comes up a lot online when I'm researching it. Is that a clinical description of anything, or are people just describing dysregulation?
Well, I suppose when you think about your experience of anger anyway, so we would have a sort of fight or flight response. Flight being run away, I want to escape. Fight being literally anger, like I'm ready to fight. And with that, that's a cortisol and an adrenaline rush often, which, gives your muscles the energy they need in order to fight. So when people probably describe that blood boiling, that is a physical sensation. And also people sometimes talk when they're angry about like the heat rising. And that's also like an adrenaline cortisol thing. Your face gets flushed, you feel energetic. And that's because anger has a job to do. It needs to fight. It needs to kind of get out of your body somehow. So that's why that kind of physical reaction is there. But that in a mum, that might look like, maybe feeling an intense physical expression of rage and standing up quickly, or maybe pushing a chair into a table, or maybe gritting your teeth or something like that. That could be what the actual physical expression looks like, that sort of under the surface blood boiling feeling.
It's not like a movie scene then?
Well, I don't know. Yeah, depends what, it could well be, couldn't it? I'm thinking of the women that I see clinically who describe it. It's not like, chucking plates across the room kind of levels of explosion, but more being short-tempered, swearing when they might not usually, just kind of be using their body in a way that doesn't feel kind of very familiar and feels kind of full of anger.
And there's so much conflation between postpartum depression, aka PPD, and postpartum anxiety and rage. So can you help us understand, is postpartum always a symptom of something diagnosable, or does it just exist on its own? And also, by any chance, do you know why it's not in that DSM?
Yeah, it's something that people describe a lot with postpartum depression and anxiety, is a kind of increased level of angry feelings. But yeah, it's not a kind of separate clinically diagnosable thing themselves. And yeah, I don't necessarily know why that is. I think it's probably because it's part of a bigger picture of postpartum mood disorders. So, and that the rage kind of comes into that, but not in itself the anxiety or depression, the diagnosable things. But I don't know how other people work, but the way I work doesn't really matter to me. Like if something is happening and you're finding it distressing and it's affecting your well-being and it's affecting your relationships, that's important to take notice of, even if it not necessarily fit very neatly into a diagnosis.
Is there a risk of it not being named or screened for by any chance?
Yeah, I mean, the screenings we use for postpartum depression do ask about, so for example, the Edinburgh scale, which is like a very commonly used one that GPs use, that midwives use, that clinicians would use in different ways. That asks about irritability and frustration, which I think if you can get a bit of a picture of that, and any scales that you use to screen, you kind of need to have conversations further about it if there's certain points that feel kind of like they could get a bit of light shed onto them. But yeah, I think there is a risk that it wouldn't get noticed. I think because of shame, it's perhaps more easy to admit that you're feeling sad or low than it is to admit that you're feeling angry or full of rage, or that you've perhaps been in a moment of rage and you've said or done something you regret. I think that can feel very isolating, that experience. But I think it's really extremely common. And I think, ask any mum and they will probably tell you one or many experiences where they felt the same.
And as I shared myself, I'm sure I had more than one or two occasions of this. But I do want to say it did not hit at day 4, which most mothers, thankfully, are now being more aware of, the fact that our hormones completely crashed then. Mine was building. So when does postpartum rage actually happen? Because the 4th trimester, day 4 is the hormone crash. The 4th trimester, we're talking about 3-month period here. But I know from experiences that it can appear at any day, like 4, 44, 144. But is there a window? And does the timing tell us anything?
Generally, when we're looking at postpartum, it's within that first year. Whether that's a good range or not, but that's what we're tending to look at, and thinking about the sort of massive hormonal fluctuation in that time, and breastfeeding starting, stopping, whatever, and your body kind of readjusting. We're thinking about that first year, but I think this can happen at any time in a parent or a mother's life. And I think particularly we're thinking about mums, and often if there are situations, a slow build up of situations that kind of highlight a violation in your expectations in some way. So there might be an expectation of more support, or there might be an expectation of feeling competent as a mother, or there might be an expectation of being able to breastfeed your baby, or an expectation you could go back to work in a manageable time, or that your partner will pick up some slack where in the system, or whatever it is. I think it's more about those things, that violation of expectation, that's sort of potentially like a bit of a drip, and then a boom feeling. And that could be very early on in a postpartum experience, but that could be at any point. So yeah, I don't necessarily think that there's any particular sort of one stage that makes a person more vulnerable necessarily, but the experience of becoming a mother is in itself vulnerable.
And if we separate out those factors that I mentioned earlier, just for those women probably listen at 3 a.m. here, who are still in the thick of feeding, pumping, and basically being touched constantly, is physical overstimulation genuinely a neurological factor, and not having to be attached to anything else like the tiredness and everything else?
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah, physical overstimulation is really important, as is noise. Anything that kind of stimulates or overstimulates or overwhelms your nervous system is likely to kind of deplete you, so that you're more likely to slip into a state of anger or rage, particularly if we're thinking about a loss or a change in your kind of sense of autonomy as well. So if you think about a breastfeeding mother who maybe would have very easily gone to a sports class in pregnancy or before, and now finds that really difficult because somebody else can't easily look after the baby, or she doesn't want to leave, or the partner doesn't feel in whatever way kind of competent to do that, then not only have you got the touch, the increased touch, the sleep deprivation, all of that, you also have got the step where you're not got access to things that help your well-being, give you a sense of self outside of parenting, all of those things. Yeah, I'd say it's individual, on an individual case-to-case basis, and it's quite nuanced what it is for somebody that could kind of trigger them in a way.
And speaking about the partner, why does the rage nearly always land on them? Not the grind baby, and not the difficult in-laws, and definitely not the system that's continuously failing us here. But why is it the person that we love the most usually? Like, what's happening here?
I think it does, just to say people do get very angry with their babies. I remember getting extremely angry with my baby when it felt like he just wouldn't sleep. And it was whatever, o'clock in the morning, the 5th wake up, like absolutely losing my cool and being, like, to my husband, you have to take him now, like this, that's it. sort of thing, and getting really angry. And then, of course, feeling a shame around how could I, all of that thing. So, yeah, lots of women describe feeling very angry towards their babies. But yeah, the anger towards a partner is really very, very common. And you said in your introduction around how relationships can really change in that first months or years, because it's about sort of a readjustment and learning how to be with each other in this new way. And if we think sometimes about situations that have violated an expectation of some kind, it might be that maybe there's a trigger of your partner's, okay, let's imagine the baby's crying, you're feeling kind of overwhelmed, already feeling, depleted, overwhelmed, sleep deprived. And then your partner may say something like, oh, why are they still crying? Something that's sort of innocuous or something like that. And then bam, that's the trigger to a rage explosion, because there's a sense of not feeling competent as a mother. Why can't I get this baby to sleep when I should be able to know what to do? There's a sense of a violation in some kind of, maybe an expectation around shared parenting, like he should be able to do this as well. Why am I, all of these things. And then you might get an experience of anger and rage where you shout at them in the middle of the night, or maybe you don't, maybe there's not there's more of an internalized expression of it, but you kind of, the anger is more inward and you would be really kind of highly critical to yourself. Yeah, we often sort of explode at the people kind of closest to us as well. And I think an important thing is that I think expressions of anger and rage have a function in a way, as they do alert us to something being wrong, to there being an unmet need, or there being something that doesn't feel right. And yeah, lots of women that I have seen have said, how terrible those moments were when they completely lost it at their partner. But at least their partner knew then how under the pressure they were, how awful they had been feeling for X amount of days before that. And sometimes there's a feeling, probably unconscious, that it takes a big expression of anger or a big rage moment to kind of get a need met, get a need noticed, get more help, get some rest, get some time, space, whatever it is that's feeling too much.
I was going to say, does it take that level for our partners to finally hear us? But is there also a resentment after that?
In what way?
Well, like the fact that we feel resentment, like we've been escalated to this point that we are now acting not as our normal selves. And now our whole body has now gone through this, and it's a lot of emotions and it's a lot of energy. And that's the only way to get our partner's attention.
So there definitely could be resentment there that needs a conversation about it, a sense of, I actually felt pushed to this. There was no other choice. I tried to talk to you in another way, and I could only happen when you were totally furious. But either way, it's signaling there, isn't it? It's signaling a need. It's signaling a feeling of resentment. It's signaling a need for something to be different. It feels maybe kind of scary or extreme in those moments.
And what does the partner need to understand? Because how can couples get to a place where they can talk about this without having to escalate to this level?
I think it's probably the person, let's say in this case, the mum experiencing these feelings, noticing what the triggers are, and if you have enough insight into that to be able to sort of notice, maybe there's a pattern, maybe, your husband works Monday to Friday and on Thursday you're more likely to slip into a position of rage. Well, that's suggesting that by Thursday you're absolutely up to the brim in whatever it is that baby care entails. And maybe that's noticing, okay, well then on Wednesday evening or afternoon I need to step out, somebody else put them to bed, go to a yoga class, whatever it is in your family that feels possible. But being able to kind of notice if there is any kind of pattern in the triggers, or maybe you feel more likely to experience rage when you haven't eaten, or whatever it is, if there's some kind of pattern to it, that can be useful. So first kind of recognizing, I think. Yeah, and then how can they talk about it? Yeah, it's difficult, especially if there's feelings of resentment there. But I think always kind of out of the moment, so not straight when you're feeling flooded with adrenaline. We know it takes 20 to 30 minutes after an experience of acute stress or anger or rage for your nervous system to kind of come back down. So maybe that's then, or a couple of hours later, or the next day, or whatever. I know when I exploded yesterday, I felt that because I felt completely depleted, whatever the scenario is. Can we talk about ways that I can get a bit more help, or that I can get a rest, or that whatever it is that feels like the unmet need in some way?
The listeners here, obviously international parents here in the Netherlands, and we are usually without family nearby and definitely not in our own language, and definitely without the inherited support systems and networks. For us, does isolation compound it in a way that is clinically distinct?
I don't know the research on that, but I would definitely anecdotally say that there's more of a likelihood of that violation and expectation. And I'm specifically using that phrase because that's what some really nice recent research spoke about of mothers noticing that they had these expectations about themselves, about motherhood, about support, whatever it was, and there's been a violation, and that violation in those expectations was trigger for rage. And so if we think about people who've maybe moved abroad, they might have expected a different kind of experience in their birthing or their parenting. And I was just thinking of a previous client who felt a lot of rage around this expectations for the kramzorg. This very Dutch thing of they're going to help me and they're going to mother me and all of these things. And that isn't some people's experience. Some people find it very exposing and violating in certain intricate ways. And that might lead to a feeling of anger. I had this expectation that this thing would be very different to what it is. And there's definitely something around support, feeling supported, mothers in that first year feeling supported in whatever ways they might be. And there can be a lot of grief and despair around perhaps not having the family or friend support that you might have imagined. Even if you've lived abroad for a long time, there's still maybe a sort of fantasy around like, oh, maybe your best friend lives nearby with a baby, or maybe your mum can come over and cook you some dinner, all these things. Even if that's not a reality, there's still a fantasy there. I think that thinking about grief and that, I think sometimes anger can be easier to feel than sadness. If you're sad about your life situation, maybe your status of having a baby away from family or whatever it is, can feel very difficult to be sort of sad and to express that grief. And maybe a way to do that's sort of bypassing that is through anger, through rage. There's a need that gets met through that might be more difficult to say, like, actually, I feel really deeply despairing and sad that this is different to what I thought it might be.
So you've named out there a couple of emotions. I want to add to that guilt, because some of us choose this life as it would be. So we can't complain. We chose to live here. But does that guilt compound the rage?
Yeah, I think anything that makes it feel like there's shoulds. Like you said, I should feel gratitude for this, or I should feel like this is the life I've chosen, I can't complain, I think is then likely to make you feel like you can't express something in a different way, or you can't talk about it in a way that feels manageable. So then it's perhaps likely to make anger and rage more likely. It's all about sort of your kind of system being depleted in some way, or there be things that feel hard to talk about, or things that feel like there's a need to be understood that's not there, or a need to be supported that doesn't feel available at the time.
And the Netherlands is known, well, Amsterdam always boasts that it has over 180 nationalities living here. When we look at all the different cultures that we have, women from different backgrounds may have been raised to suppress their anger entirely through patriarchal, through religious, whatever it might be. Does unexpressed anger find a way out anyway?
Yeah, I think actually women generally, globally, are kind of not taught ways to express anger, and are taught implicitly or explicitly that anger will ruin your relationships, will make you not likable, is somehow kind of uncontrollable and dangerous, perhaps. And these are sort of messages we get in lots of different ways. Add that into a sort of supermum myth idea that mothers have to be calm and gentle and good in whatever way, then it makes it almost impossible to express anger. Righteous anger. If something is not happening in the way that you expected or you hoped for, anger is a normal response to that. But it's very deeply kind of stigmatized and shamed, which makes it even harder to know that you're not alone, that it's very normal, that it's important, in fact, signaling something important.
So let's talk about what actually helps, because I want to be specific, because I know our listeners will want to know, what can you do in the moment when you feel the rage rising? And what do you do in the longer term to actually address what's actually underneath it?
So if you feel the rage rising and you want to always be safe, of course, around your baby, your toddlers, yourself, whatever. So it might mean, if you really feel like, I'm having a shaking rage feeling, place your baby somewhere safe. As I said before, cortisol and adrenaline have a job to do. They almost need to get out of your body. So that might be sort of shaking yourself or hitting something soft or safe or stomping your feet or making a big loud noise or something like that. Anyone, when they've experienced anger, there's a need for it to come out. And sometimes that might be coming out and swearing at a partner or something. But if you can kind of notice it and redirect it into another way, that can be helpful. I've spoken with clients before about sort of taking your shoes off. And if you might be in a moment of feeling very, very overwhelmed, and if you have space and you're able to do this, not in the out behind necessarily, but at home, take your shoes off, feel your feet on the ground. What does the carpet feel like? If it's cold, what's that like? And also sort of breathing into your feet can be very grounding. And there's an idea from dialectical behavioural therapy, which is, a lot about emotional regulation of willing hands and expression of anger. So if you have your hands out, like on your lap, open, palms up, or to the side of you, palms towards, it's very hard to express anger in that pose. So there's something very kind of grounding about it, to be able to sort of have open, willing hands, to be able to sort of purposefully be like, okay, I'm going to breathe into this moment. Those are sort of in the moment things, but I think what we're most often talking about is these unmet needs and how can you find ways to get those needs met. And maybe that would take a lot of working out what it even is. Like, what is this feeling that keeps kind of bubbling up? Is it suggesting that it needs some more space, time, support, connection, emotional, physical intimacy, whatever it is that feels kind of important, to be able to find a way to take that or ask for that, or kind of noticing it first.
In the Netherlands, what are our actual options if we recognize ourselves in this conversation and we are going to seek support? Can you just walk us through, do we go to the verloskundige? Do we talk to the huisarts, to the GGZ? What's the path looking like for an international parent here who might be struggling?
I would see it as part of general kind of postpartum distress. And with that can be low mood, that can be anxiety, whatever it is. If it's feeling distressing for you, it's important to take notice of. And if it's not just a sort of one-off moment, but something that feels kind of a bit persistent, or it's coming and going and it's distressing, then we take notice of it. And if you're still under the care of the midwives, within 6 weeks, and they're brilliant people to talk to, and they're really good at talking about mental health changes anyway, which this would kind of come under. Otherwise, you can go to your GP. They'll, I think, be pretty used. They're definitely used to talking about changes in mood, and this is that, really, isn't it? If you're not used to feeling like this, you could just go, I just don't feel myself. Things are changing. I'm noticing I'm feeling more quick to anger, whatever it is, and they should be able to refer you to a psychologist or some sort of psychological support within the system to help. And something that I will say is that working now with lots and lots of women who often come with this as the first symptom of something not feeling right, is often something a little bit underneath that anger, in terms of finding it hard to set boundaries, for example, or finding it hard to ask for what you need generally, or there being something in the relationship that feels like it was always difficult and now has got extra challenging through parenting. That's why I think it's kind of important to explore it. It's probably a symptom. It's probably a signal. This rage it's unlikely to be kind of just on its own, but sort of signalling something else that might be important to look into or to think about.
If you could put one thing on a billboard for any mother who's pregnant or in postpartum right now about postpartum rage, about postpartum mental health, about asking for help, what would you say?
That with the right support, including rest and connection, you can feel very different very quickly.
And one last question for the partners. We're looking at postpartum. What would you want the partners to know about the birthing situation and the postpartum afterwards? What would you be able to say to them that you would really like them to understand in that preparation for that period?
I guess in some way or form, expect that there might be anger and explosions, and that might come your way, and to as much as possible be generous with that, and to, I know that's very difficult, but to maybe take as least defensive as possible stance, to be able to understand that it's probably not per se about you, but maybe about the way they're feeling, and maybe there are things about you too, but it's a signal for more kind of support or more a way of doing it differently. So, and also for those women perhaps who are more kind of internalized in that anger, to sort of notice if your partner is withdrawn, or they feel kind of like they're experiencing anger and rage, but it's more sort of private. Because that's something else that comes up a lot, is people saying no one would even have any idea that I'm feeling this way. They're not necessarily like exploding, but they're feeling a sort of a seething anger a lot of the time. So I would sort of say, if you're somebody close to a pregnant or a postpartum mum, like, what are you noticing? Do they seem themselves? Are they seeming kind of changed or short-tempered or whatever it is? And if they are thinking, proactively, what might they need from you as a partner? And how can you make space to have the conversations to understand a bit better about that?
Dr. Naomi, thank you so much for joining us back here on Zam Parenting, and for kicking off this Maternal Mental Health Month series that we're having, because these are the kind of conversations that we shouldn't have to be quietly talking about. These are the ones we loudly need to be talking about, so that everyone knows that there's no shame. The rest of the series is going to be talking about various different issues, but the postpartum rage is definitely the one that is rarely found on Facebook groups and WhatsApp groups or in podcasts. So Dr. Naomi, thank you so much for joining us and having such an open conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.